Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week I'm talking again with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, featuring a bunch of unseen footage from my series, The Coverup. It's relevant because he was just confirmed as the new director of the National Institutes of Health. And in this episode, you'll learn the sweet karma of being labeled a fringe epidemiologist by the former head of the NIH. Now Jay is in that chair. It's going to be awesome. Check it out. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty.
Days after we wrote the declaration, wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling me a fringe epidemiologist. I think I shared a card with you.
Yeah, I have your fringe epidemiologist business card here.
A friend of mine made up the, I'm going to put that on my grave. It's like fringe, it says fringe epidemiology on it. And my friend of mine made that up for me. Then he called for a devastating takedown of the premises of the declaration.
When we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, this is in October of 2020, 4 days after we wrote it, the head of the NIH, Francis Collins, National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling the three primary authors, me, Sunetra Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff, he called it the three of us fringe epidemiologists. I mean, it's well, whatever, I'll just leave that aside, right?
Stanford, Harvard, Oxford,
yes, right?
Fringe institutions. For sure.
Well, the thing is that's why he wrote that email, right? He wrote that, and then he called for a devastating published takedown of the premises of the declaration. He wrote that email because the institutions from which we wrote, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, threatened him and his lockdown strategy. Mm-hmm. It threatened his underling Tony Fauci's strategy, right? It was when we wrote the declaration. Almost hundreds of thousands of regular people signed on to it. People sent in from around the world. They sent us translations of the document. It's a page document. You can go look it online, see if you find it controversial. They sent us translations into 30 different languages. Almost immediately, we got tens of thousands of scientists and epidemiologists signing on. What the Great Barrington Declaration did, the reason why it was important is not actually the ideas in it. The ideas in it are as old as the hills. Yeah. The reason it was important is because it told the world that there was not actually a scientific consensus in favor of lockdown and the lockdown strategy we adopted. And that's why Tony Fauci and Francis Collins acted the way they did. That was the threat. It undermined the illusion that there was a consensus around this lockdown, and they couldn't abide that. Now, this goes back to your point about Hayek and decentral. I mean, I'm just like trying to imagine what Hayek would have made of the interchange between Rand Paul and Tony Fauci in the Senate, where very famously Tony Fauci's response to Rand Paul was like, if you're criticizing me, you're not simply criticizing a man, you are criticizing science itself, right, or something very close to that. I mean, in a sense, it's like this like, you know, la science c'est moi, like the Louis XIV kind of moment for a science bureaucrat. Right. The arrogance is almost unbelievable. And the Great Barrington Declaration, what it did is it punctured that arrogance, because it said, look, there are a lot of prominent, well-known, completely reasonable, not actually fringe scientists who don't like the strategy you've adopted, who think that the strategy you've adopted was an enormous mistake. And that's why you saw this smearing campaign. And they're very effective at that. Like they have, I started getting calls from reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip. Yeah. I never said those words. I never even thought those words. It's not in the Great Barrington Declaration. It's a piece of propaganda designed to destroy the credibility of anyone who says it, because my primary goal is to save life, right? Protect vulnerable populations. The key tenet of the plan of the Great Barrington Declaration is focused protection of the old. How is that letting the virus rip? I mean, and then there's this sort of demonization of the idea of herd immunity, as if it's some sort of weird conspiracy theory or strategy, when in fact it's just a biological fact. Right. This pandemic ends when there's sufficient immunity in the population. It's not now. What we know is that kind of immunity doesn't protect you from getting the disease over again. What it does, it'll be more like the other coronaviruses, where you can get them over again, but you don't get severely ill. Right. So I think that idea that herd immunity is a strategy, they use that as a propaganda tool against, in favor of lockdown, as if somehow the endpoint of lockdown strategies is also herd immunity.
So I haven't really told anyone much about this yet, but like this is a graph that I made in July of 2020. It's a graph of the case fatality rate from COVID from March to the end of July, and it was just like a little bit of technical challenge because you have to people delay in deaths. That takes a few weeks to report the number of deaths. So I had a little model to adjust for that. And then there's a delay in like 2 weeks delay in like people dying from getting COVID and dying, at least early in the pandemic. So I was like really pretty proud of it. I sent it to Scott Atlas, who was then the advisor to President Trump. And just thinking he'd be interested and curious about this. And it shows this huge decline in case fatality from early in the pandemic to later in the pandemic. And the next day, President Trump is showing my graph to the entire country. And I was stunned. Like I've been writing and doing statistical work for a long time, and it's of course our ambition as health policy people to have people see our work. Never have I had gone from a little bit of statistical work to everyone seeing it overnight. And then when I got to visit with President Trump in the Oval Office, because Scott arranged this in this meeting where he asked me if he'd saved 2 million lives. Afterwards I asked him to sign it, and so that is President Trump's signature.
That's a signature?
That is his signature.
Wow.
Yeah, just it was a little bit of a fanboy thing. I mean, it's a little embarrassing, frankly, but
So Scott,
Go ahead.
so I was talking to Scott Atlas about this meeting, and he said that Deborah Birx was doing everything possible to try to spike the actual meeting from happening at all, and the compromised position was you get 5 minutes. But then once you guys got in there, it was very clear that the president wanted to talk to you. He wanted to learn. He wanted to ask questions. And it went on. How long did it go on?
I mean, it well over an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah. The President Trump it was very clear when we met with him that he was just thirsty for information. Like he was getting information from one source, really, from Debbie Birx, from Tony Fauci, and the task force. That focused on the lockdowns as a way to manage the pandemic. In fact, he even asked me in the meeting whether, he asked me if he'd saved 2 million lives by locking down in March. That was the assertion. That's based on, I assume, this Imperial College model that said that if the president didn't lock down the country, 2 million people would die within a couple of months. Of course, 2 million people didn't die. So I had to tell him no. Frankly, it was like hard to tell the president that he hadn't saved 2 million lives because it was such a important decision that he'd made. But yeah, he seemed hungry for information. So we were I went into that meeting telling him open schools, that the scientific evidence was very, very clear that closing schools did not do much to protect people. And I told him to protect older people better. It was essentially the substance of the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. I think that the information environment that he'd been exposed to was incredibly one-sided. That Debbie Birx and Tony Fauci did everything they could to narrow the view of the scientific community's opinions about lockdowns that the president saw and manipulate him so that he would make the decisions that they wanted. That he hired Scott to come and give him advice, suggest to him he was uncomfortable with only getting one view. He was still, the question is, why didn't he let Fauci and Birx go?
Yeah.
I mean, he clearly wanted multiple views, but he was only being exposed to one view.
He was captured. I mean, the basis of much of what we talked to Scott about yesterday was that Trump's first instinct was you can't lock down the economy. That would be a disaster. And they somehow changed his mind, Fauci and Birx. And it's clear to me that I think he regrets that decision perhaps to this day. I don't think Trump's capable of ever saying out loud that he made a mistake, but the question is, why did he let those guys win when he knew better?
Well, that's the question. I don't know that he knew better, right? He's not a scientist, and he's not someone like Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis Ron DeSantis called me during the pandemic in September 2020, and it was really clear to me. We talked for 2 hours. He had read papers, not just of mine, but papers, like scientific papers, and is capable of it. I don't think Trump is like that. I don't think he's capable of reading the scientific literature.
Yeah.
But he is a curious man, and so he, in the sense of like he wants to know what the right thing to do is. I mean, this is not an ideological thing. It's like you have this disease spreading around. What's the right thing to do? And he was owed, as the president, a full picture of what the scientific community was actually saying. And instead, what he was offered up until the moment that he hired Scott was a narrow view of what the scientific literature, scientific community was saying. The set of people, the very powerful people who said, we need to lock down or else we're going to kill a lot of people, ignoring all the harms from the lockdown. That's the scientific view he was provided. And he wanted more. He wanted, and it was, the scientific community owed him more. And the scientists, bureaucrats that controlled the information he saw did a disservice to the world by not allowing a broader set of scientists in front of him. If we had had an actual functioning First Amendment during the pandemic, a lot of the harms that we saw to people, a lot of people that would have been avoided. Many people that are now dead would be alive. The government was the number one source of misinformation during the pandemic. It put forward very destructive ideas like 2 weeks to slow the spread, and lockdown will save us from COVID. The infection fatality rate is tremendously high when it's not. There's no real age stratification of risk. We're all equally at risk. There's no immunity after COVID recovery. There's no the lockdowns are not all that harmful to the economy. The school closures are not that harmful to kids. Mask mandates are going to save us from COVID. Vaccines will stop the spread of COVID. There are no such things as vaccine injuries. You can go at item after item after item, and it's the government that was the primary source of misinformation. People structured their lives around this government misinformation. And had there been a functioning First Amendment, there would have been more effective pushback against these government misinformation. The whole premise of a lot of the questioning by the Supreme Court justices was that the government got it right and they're protecting people from misinformation, when in fact exactly the opposite is true. And of course that's the point of the First Amendment, is to protect the people from the government when it gets it wrong.
Which they do sometimes.
Hopefully I got it long. I could go on longer with the list.
We've had some multiple conversations about this, about the arrogance and hypocrisy of the Faucis of the world that actually think they know better than the entire scientific process itself.
People have a tremendous wide array of values, objectives. Societies are designed to mediate that. Civilizations are created when we can learn from each other in close connection with each other. The kinds of things that produce the sort of advances in human well-being, I think, promote those kinds of close connections, not separate each other apart. And we certainly don't reorganize society around one idea, one goal, right? The key insight is that our societies have a vast plural set of goals that sometimes are at odds with each other, but we mediate them, we trade with each other, we learn from each other to advance as many of those goals as we can. To reorganize around one goal, it's, as you say, the height of hubris.
This mantra of money versus lives, that was a talking point that echoed in every critique of any questions asked anywhere. And maybe it's just a vestige of the old debate about the precautionary principle. And those of us that understand that economic prosperity and ability to bring those coconuts to market is a life or death question. But it also is just curious to me, like suddenly the talking point was everywhere. There was an echo chamber. And of course, we'll get into this, but the names they started calling you, this was designed an echo chamber thing.
Yeah, I mean, but on the plus side, that Wall Street Journal piece also brought a lot of very constructive people into my orbit. There's a man named Dan Eichner who runs steroid testing and other testing for Major League Baseball, or he's like a contractor with Major League Baseball. He had ordered a whole bunch of antibody test kits from a Chinese company, and he was going to use them to see if Major League Baseball players had been infected. But when he read the op-ed, his idea was, I want to use these for science. Called me and my colleagues up, offered them for free for us to use. And a whole bunch of people at Stanford actually, they read this and they wanted to help actually do the study we suggested in the op-ed. What I actually expected out of the op-ed was that the CDC would run this study. It's actually their job to run this study, not me. But when these...
Would them taking that idea and running with it been a more normal response before COVID?
I mean, that's just the normal scientific response. You have a parameter that's absolutely vital for everything we're going to do, every decision we're going to make. And these are the decisions that change the lives of billions of people, right? Do we lock down or not lock down? Who is most at risk of this disease? How do we scale the risk of this disease relative to other threats in people's lives? This one study informs all of that. It was the obvious study to do. I was actually very surprised that it hadn't already been conducted by the CDC, which is partly why we wrote that op-ed.
Yeah, but that's maybe a shift in the government response to this pandemic. You would have naturally just expected them to have done that.
Yeah, I would have expected to do that.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with BlazeTV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. I just don't think we know exactly what's going on yet.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there's been this interplay between the national security apparatus to manage bioterror events and the public health apparatus to manage, pandemics.
Yeah.
And they merged and intertwined in ways that I didn't know was possible before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like I'm on the civilian side. I've never experienced.
You and I have never seen this before.
Yeah.
But maybe, and my theory is, if such a thing is happening, it's been going on for a long time, and you have this clash where voices like yours, when you went on Twitter, you immediately garnered a very large audience, and they immediately tried to snuff it out. Back in the day, they could just censor or buy off or whatever they would do to hijack the New York Times. And like when it was 3 papers of record, they could control the process, and suddenly it became radically democratized, and they couldn't control the process anymore. So they have this overwrought, completely un-American, anti-First Amendment response, where they're sorting through tweets and saying, well, that guy can't say that.
I mean, the censorship apparatus is almost certainly, there's a military national defense side of this. There's just no question, right? So why is CISA? CISA is this cyber infrastructure security agency. It's part of the State Department. The nominal argument was that we need to figure out a way to manage misinformation or disinformation efforts by foreign actors in the United States, right?
Right.
Why are they involved in COVID censorship?
Right.
The apparatus includes the FBI. By the way, I know this because the discovery in this Missouri versus Biden lawsuit has revealed vast amounts of evidence about which agencies of the federal government are involved in essentially telling social media companies what to censor and who to censor.
Yeah.
Right. So we know the FBI is involved. We know that the State Department's involved. Why are they involved in censoring Americans? And of course, there's also like the public health infrastructure is involved, right? So there's the CDC is involved, the Surgeon General's office is involved, and the White House itself is involved. Right?
Yep.
So you have this like civilian national security sort of cooperation in censoring Americans, based on scientific issues.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's creepy. Adam, are you a fan of Stranger Things?
I love Stranger Things. Yes.
So my entire paradigm, and you may not know this, but Stranger Things was inspired by an actual government covert operation called MK Ultra, which was all of the psychedelic experimentation, completely immoral, unethical.
I actually didn't know that.
Where
interesting.
the national security guys, I think the core was the CIA, was trying to figure out how to get the enemy, the Soviets at the time, to tell the truth. So it's like a kind of a truth serum thing. So they're dosing people against their will to see what will happen. So anyway, that's the inspiration for Stranger Things. And you think about the first season in particular, where the national security of the United States embarks on a very covert, dangerous mad science experiment that ends up unleashing hell on earth.
Yeah.
And I'm like, maybe the truth is stranger than fiction. I don't know.
Could be. I mean,
But now I've gone too far. Now you're like, wow.
well, I don't. I mean, it's hard.
crazy.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I try to stick to exactly what I know, and what I know is
Yes.
scary enough,
Yeah.
right? So if it's just I'm going to prevent pandemics by going and finding bat pathogens and bringing them into the large city centers, and then I'm going to augment their function so they can infect humans. I mean, that's bad enough,
Right.
even if it's not national security related. It's this, as you said, this hubris at the center of it, this idea that we can control nature just to such a degree that we can plan for things that we have really no honest way of looking into unless we're fooling ourselves, at least not in any way that's at all safe or worth the risks that we take in order, relative to what the potential harms could be.
And that's my ultimate goal, is obviously accountability, but accountability that ensures that we stop doing whatever it is we did.
I think that given the scope of the disaster that has happened as a result of this, whatever process led to these decisions, we are owed a honest accounting, at the very least, of the decision makers, of the decisions, and what occurred. We're owed a real COVID commission, and not run by the people that made the decisions, but rather that finally invite outside scientists in that were critical of decisions to ask questions. And it's just like after a plane crash, right? You would have the NTSB come and do an evaluation. They'd look at the black box. They still have those on the planes, I guess. And the idea is not primarily to point fingers. For the most part, people don't point fingers in those. But primarily, it's to figure out what went wrong, so that you can adopt reform so that it doesn't happen again. That's what we're owed, I think.
Yeah.
And wherever the chips may fall, let them fall. I mean, I think it is really important that we know the answers to the questions you're asking.
Yeah, we have to know so that it doesn't happen again. And this is sort of an offhanded comment, but I have to say, if it was in fact a biosecurity strategy with the best of intentions, sort of wildly arrogant and scientific in its nature, and running a gain-of-function prohibition in the United States and going to a shoddy lab in Wuhan, in China, presumably one of the countries that we would consider a potential national security threat, that doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Well, it could be if, for instance, okay, you have this dual civilian military kind of dual use kind of technology. What if this was partly a way for the United States to keep their eyes on what was happening in the Chinese biosecurity agents kind of apparatus, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to say unless there's some openness and clarity from the government around this. There was some game potentially happening that people were playing with each other.
I feel like the Chinese government has not been particularly forthcoming.
I think that's true, but honestly, like the American government hasn't been particularly forthcoming either.
Yeah.
So it's just, we're in a situation where a lot of the key decision makers that made these decisions have the power to block public scrutiny of their decisions. I don't see how that's consistent with democracy, that you can have a relatively small group of very powerful people make these decisions in government with no oversight possibility at all, or very, very little, very limited, where every single bit of oversight takes a tremendous amount of effort by a small group of policymakers or scientists on the outside, or people asking for FOIA requests that are thwarted, or you have to do the massive lawsuits backed by states in order to get anywhere. What we're owed is transparency. We're owed an honest discussion so we can do our own evaluation. Let the people understand what actually happened. Let the people decide how we actually want to make decisions around the regulation of these scientific and public health processes.
On this, John. So there was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2020, actually, that the theme was policy contagion. Right, one country copied another after another, and there's this element inside policy making. If you're a politician, you don't really, you look at the evidence, you're like, this is too complicated. It looks very risky no matter what I do. It's just easier, less risky if I just do what everyone else is doing. Then if it all goes wrong, I can't be blamed.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a politician looking for a guru to tell them what to do. There's a groupthink among the gurus. People look at China and, oh gosh, it's January 2020 and they've solved the pandemic with a month lockdown. That idea, the mathematical models come out, the idea spreads among a relatively small group of people who then tell the politicians, look, if you don't do this, you're going to kill 2 million people in the United States, 500,000 people in the UK, whatever the models say. And then they say, okay, if I don't do this, I'm going to get blamed for 2 million people dying. It's safer if I just do this. Even if it goes wrong, at least I did the right thing. I mean, I'm not a Trump ally. I'm just a scientist. And what happened during the pandemic was that the First Amendment basically it was abrogated. It wasn't followed. The government didn't follow it explicitly, so that scientific discussion couldn't happen. In order to create an illusion of consensus in favor of false ideas that the government itself espoused and that it pushed forward as a basis of policy. The idea that something like that could happen in the United States is still a shock to me. I never imagined such a thing was possible in the United States of America. It scares the living daylights out of me. And if the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't say that it was wrong to have done that, if it doesn't acknowledge that at all, then I really fear for our republic.
So I don't know if there's ever in history been a situation where, when you sue the government, you're suing the office. So if you sue Anthony Fauci, you're actually suing like whatever his title was at NIH, director of NIH. So when he goes, then the new person, you're suing them. So Jay is suing the NIH, and now he's going to be the director of the NIH. I don't know. I don't think this has ever happened.
Will he have to testify against himself?
My guess is we'll have to make some adjustments to the lawsuit. But people have asked me what's going to happen. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think ever in history has someone sued an agency and then become the head of that agency. So it's an interesting question.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.